Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. Before sunrise on July 1, 1916, London slept beneath a gray sky. In quiet neighborhoods, church bells stood still, and the morning papers waited on doorsteps filled with headlines that spoke of a great push to come. Across the channel, the same air shook with a distant roar, a sound too deep for thunder, too steady for weather. It was the voice of 1,500 British guns shaking the fields of northern France. The Somme had begun to wake. For nearly 2 years, the Western Front had been motionless, a scar across Europe from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Millions had died for yards of ground. Every attack had bled itself dry against wire and concrete. Generals on both sides called it positional warfare. The soldiers called it the waiting. Out of that stalemate came a plan simple in logic and enormous in scale, to strike everywhere at once and exhaust the enemy by force of numbers. The River Somme was chosen not because it was important but because it lay between the British and French armies, a convenient meeting point. The ground was open, the ridges low, the roads good. General Joseph Joffre, France's commander-in-chief, had imagined a joint attack with the French carrying the main weight and the British assisting from the north. But in February, Germany had attacked Verdun, and the French had been fighting there ever since, burning through their strength just to hold the line. By summer, the burden of the Somme had shifted to Britain, a nation still learning what industrial war truly meant. General Sir Douglas Haig, newly in command of the British Expeditionary Force, saw the Somme as both duty and opportunity. He was calm, religious, certain that persistence could conquer all. Success, he wrote, comes to those who endure the longest. He believed his new army, the volunteers raised by Kitchener's call in 1914, was ready. These were not professionals, but men from shops, schools, and mines. They were eager to prove themselves, confident that courage and discipline could overcome the machine. Haig's subordinate general, Henry Rawlinson, preferred smaller, measured steps. He argued that the army should advance one trench at a time, securing ground as it went. Haig wanted more. He dreamed of a breakthrough so vast that the cavalry would pour through the gap and roll up the German line from behind. The compromise between them became doctrine, a single massive assault supported by a week-long bombardment that would destroy everything in its path. The bombardment began on June 24th. From dawn to dusk, the guns never stopped. The ground shook for miles, the air filled with the taste of cordite. Soldiers described the noise as a living thing, a rolling drum that never ends. Nearly 2 million shells were fired in 7 days. From the air, the battlefield appeared unrecognizable. Fields turned to ash, trenches destroyed. Officers told their men nothing could survive such fire. But beneath that fury, the enemy lived. The Germans had spent months preparing. Their engineers dug deep into the chalk hills, building bunkers 40 feet underground with electric lights, bunks, and stoves. When the shelling began, they simply went below, waiting it out. The walls bend, one officer wrote. The candles die, the air turns to dust, but we endure. Above them, British optimism swelled with every explosion. To those watching from behind, the bombardment looked like the end of the German army. The men at the front believed they were witnessing the birth of victory. It was as if the world itself was being remade, one corporal said. Yet what the shells destroyed most effectively was belief, in precision and control, in the illusion that a plan could master chaos. While the guns roared, preparations went on. Engineers built railways to feed the front with shells. Telephone wires stretched through the trenches. Mines were packed under the German positions, ready to explode minutes before the assault. The soldiers practiced their advance in open fields behind the lines, moving over chalk outlines of enemy trenches. They were told not to run, but to walk, keeping perfect formation. You'll find no resistance, the officers said. It will be easy. They believed them. Most of these men belonged to the PALS battalions, groups recruited from the same towns and factories so friends could fight side by side. It had seemed a fine idea when the war began. No one had thought what it would mean when they died together, too. They filled their last hours with quiet routines, cleaning rifles, writing letters, joking about what they would eat in Berlin. Captain Charles May of the Manchester Regiment wrote to his wife, if I must die, remember that I thought of you to the end." He folded the letter carefully and sealed it in his tunic. Behind the front, Britain waited. In the towns and cities, factories worked day and night to make shells. Posters promised that the coming battle would change the war forever. Mothers read the papers and believed their sons were marching toward victory. They could not yet imagine what kind of dawn was waiting. At the front, the thunder grew. Soldiers joked that they would go mad if they ever heard silence again. The earth shook beneath them like a beating heart. It was not sound anymore, one man said. It was the air itself. By the 6th day, even the birds had fled. On June 30th, the orders arrived. The attack would begin at 7:30 the next morning. 2 minutes before, the mines would explode. At 0 hour, the guns would lift their fire from the first German line to the second, and the infantry would advance through the smoke. The timing was perfect on paper. In the trenches, the men stared at their watches and wondered if perfection existed anywhere beyond the map. That night, the bombardment reached its peak. The horizon glowed red as the shells fell faster and closer until the sky seemed to catch fire. The men huddled in their dugouts, smoking, praying, or just staring at the trembling walls. "We were ready," one said, though none of us knew for what. Haig, miles behind the line, wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow the great battle begins. The men are in fine spirits. I feel confident of success." The words were calm, certain, untouched by the storm that was about to break. At 7:28 a.m., the mines went off. At Hawthorne Ridge, one of them erupted in a column of flame and debris 600 feet high. The shock rolled across the valley and struck the waiting lines like wind. 2 minutes later, the whistles blew. All along the front, 120,000 men climbed their ladders and stepped into the morning light. They moved through the mist in steady lines, their uniforms clean, their rifles slung, their hearts steady. Behind them, the guns thundered on. Ahead of them, in the smoke that hid the German trenches, something waited, silent, invisible, and alive. The bombardment had promised everything. The next hours would reveal what it had truly achieved and what it had not. By the winter of 1915, the Great War had already consumed its promises. The quick victory imagined the year before had vanished into trenches that neither side could escape. Europe had become a siege of mud and hunger, a war of numbers instead of movement. Commanders tried new weapons, new tactics, new hopes. Nothing worked. Out of that desperation came a plan as simple as it was brutal. If one attack could not break the stalemate, then 1,000 guns and 1,000,000 men might. The logic was sound on paper. The Allies would strike everywhere at once, stretching the German army until it snapped. In the east, Russia would attack. In the south, Italy would press the Alps. And on the Western Front, France and Britain would launch a joint assault along the River Somme. The Germans could not hold all fronts at once, or so everyone believed. It was a plan of cooperation, coordination, and faith in firepower. General Sir Douglas Haig, who had just taken command of the British Expeditionary Force, saw in this plan a chance for redemption. Britain's army was no longer the small professional force of 1914. It was vast, industrial, and full of volunteers eager to prove themselves. Haig's confidence was absolute. The key to victory, he told his staff, is pressure, unrelenting pressure. He saw the Somme as both a duty to his allies and a chance to show that Britain could lead modern war. His subordinate, General Henry Rawlinson, saw it differently. He favored limited advances, a line at a time, measured and secure. Haig wanted a breakthrough, one enormous blow that would roll the Germans back for miles and restore movement to the front. Between their philosophies lay a compromise that would cost more lives than either could imagine. The artillery would crush the enemy first, then the infantry would walk across open ground to occupy what remained. It was a plan built on precision, timing, and faith in the machine. The British called their part of the offensive the Big Push. The French were to lead with 40 divisions on the southern sector. The British, still learning, would hold the north. But when Germany attacked Verdun in February, everything changed. France bled itself dry defending the city, pouring men and shells into that furnace until there was almost nothing left. Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, turned to Hague. The Somme would now be a British battle with France playing only a supporting role. Britain's new army had never fought a battle of this scale. It was made of volunteers, miners, clerks, teachers, factory workers, men who had trained for months but had yet to face fire. They believed in the war and their officers, in the idea that courage could shape history. "We were ready," one recalled. "We just didn't know for what." They would soon find out. The plan called for 7 days of continuous shelling. The guns would pound the German line, cutting the wire and crushing the trenches. At the end of the bombardment, the infantry would climb from their own trenches and walk forward in calm formation. They were told not to run. There would be no need. "You will find nothing alive," officers promised. "You'll walk across and occupy the ground." It was the kind of confidence that can exist only far from the front. Haig's army had never commanded so much firepower. 1,500 guns, thousands of tons of shells, and a timetable measured in minutes. The soldiers felt the earth shake beneath them as the bombardment began on June 24th. It never stopped. "The sky was made of fire," one observer wrote. "You could taste it in your mouth." For 7 days and nights, the guns thundered, and men told each other that nothing human could live through it. But the Germans had not built their empire on belief. Their defenses on the Somme were a masterpiece of engineering. 3 lines of trenches connected by tunnels, dug into chalk and reinforced with concrete. Their dugouts went 40 feet deep, safe from all but the heaviest shells. When the bombardment began, they went below, lighting candles and waiting in the dark. "We are buried alive," a German wrote home. "When it ends, we will rise like ghosts." Above them, the British gunners believed the wire was gone. They fired light shells when they needed heavy ones, timed fuses when they needed delay. Many shells were duds, fired but never exploded, sinking harmlessly into the mud. The infantry didn't know. They trusted the math, the maps, and the message from above. "The barrage has done its work." By the last day of June, the men were ready. They had rehearsed the assault behind the lines, walking across chalk fields marked to resemble German trenches. They practiced advancing in lines 50 yards apart, bayonets fixed, carrying packs that weighed more than 60 pounds. "Keep steady," the officers told them. "Don't break formation." The soldiers joked that it would be a walk in the park. That night, the bombardment reached its peak. The guns fired faster and heavier, shaking the air like thunder trapped in a box. Rain began to fall, turning the trenches slick and white with chalk. Men tried to sleep but couldn't. They wrote letters, smoked, or simply stared at the walls. "It was like waiting for the world to end," one private said. In the dugouts, officers read the orders again. At 7:28 a.m., 10 mines would detonate beneath the German lines. At 7:30, the whistles would blow. The men would advance shoulder to shoulder behind a final lifting barrage. The entire plan was written down to the minute. Success seemed inevitable. Miles behind the front, Haig wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we shall see the dawn of a new era. The men are in good spirits. I am confident of success." In London, church bells waited to ring. In towns across Britain, families went to bed believing that by morning the war would have turned. At dawn, the guns reached their final crescendo. The sky was white with smoke. The air trembled. At 7:28, the mines exploded. The blast at Hawthorne Ridge rose like a volcano, hurling men, wood, and stone hundreds of feet into the sky. 2 minutes later, the whistles sounded along the line. 120,000 men climbed the ladders and stepped into the morning light. They moved in straight lines through mist and smoke, rifles slung, packs heavy, believing that the way was clear. Behind them, the guns kept firing, shifting their aim to the second German line. Ahead of them, the Germans were already climbing from their bunkers, machine guns poised. On the maps, it all still looked perfect. In reality, it was about to collapse. They were Kitchener's men, the volunteers who had answered the call when Britain first went to war. Clerks, miners, shopkeepers, students, ordinary men who had traded tools and pens for rifles. They had marched through their towns to cheers and flags, believing they were joining a cause that would make history. 2 years later, on the eve of the Somme, that belief had hardened into something quieter, endurance. "We have been trained," one man wrote, to do as we're told and not to think too much about it. By June 1916, the new army had grown into something the world had never seen. Entire divisions filled with men who had never been soldiers before, trained, drilled, and molded into precision. Their uniforms were frayed, their boots soaked, but their pride was real. The army that waited behind the Somme was the largest Britain had ever assembled. The men carried photographs in their pockets, good luck charms in their helmets, and letters home in their tunics. They didn't think about dying. They thought about getting through the first hour. The officers told them the German line was already broken. 7 days of bombardment, 2 million shells. No army could live through that. You will find only corpses, one captain said. The men believed him. It was easier to believe than to doubt. Doubt had no place in the trenches. We were too new to question anything, a corporal recalled. They said walk, so we walked. The waiting was the hardest part. In the front lines, the bombardment rolled like thunder, a noise that never ended. The ground shook and dust drifted down from the trench walls. Men learned to tell one shell from another by sound. The heavy moan of a howitzer, the sharp whine of a field gun, the dull cough of a mortar. They spoke little. Some played cards, others smoked in silence. We didn't talk about dying, one soldier said. We talked about tea. Each battalion had its rituals before battle. The Scots sang, the Irish prayed, the English joked. Cigarettes were passed around, bayonets checked, letters finished. A few men wrote to their mothers promising they would come home soon. Private Cyril Jose, 16 years old, wrote, the guns go on day and night, but they sound like music now. We're ready. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Captain Charles May of the 22nd Manchester Regiment wrote to his wife, I don't want to die. I want to see you again. But if I must, remember that I thought of you to the end. His men remembered him as calm, kind, and certain. When the bombardment shook their trench, he told them it would all be over soon. They believed him. The week of shelling blurred into eternity. The sky flashed night and day. The air stank of cordite and rain. Birds vanished. Even the rats hid. The world was nothing but noise. One soldier wrote, we forgot what silence sounded like. When the guns finally paused, the stillness felt unnatural, like standing inside a heartbeat that had stopped. Across no man's land, the Germans waited underground. They had survived the storm in bunkers 40 feet deep, listening to the ground crack above them. When the shelling stopped, they knew what it meant. The infantry was coming. We were days deaf, covered in dust, one German wrote. But we were alive and we were ready. Back in the British trenches, watches were synchronized. The men checked their rifles, adjusted their packs, and lined up behind the parapets. Officers moved quietly along the trench, touching shoulders, murmuring final words. Good luck, lads. Keep steady. See you after. No one said goodbye. They climbed the ladders because that was the order. At 7:28 a.m., the mines exploded. The blast at Hawthorne Ridge tore a hole in the horizon. A mountain of earth thrown into the sky. The shock rolled down the valley, shaking the air in the British trenches. 2 minutes later, the whistles blew. The first waves stepped forward into the smoke. They walked, not ran, just as they'd been taught. The air was thick and gray, the ground soft under their boots. The men kept their lines straight, bayonets glinting faintly in the morning light. For a moment, it almost looked like a parade. Behind them, the second waves followed, then the third. The whole plain seemed to move. At first, there was no reply. Then somewhere in the mist ahead, a machine gun opened fire. A sharp cutting sound, joined by another, then 100 more. The air filled with the hiss of bullets, the whistle of shells, the screams of men. We thought the world was ending, one soldier said. Then we realized it was just beginning. Officers shouted for order, waving their canes, their voices lost in the roar. Men dropped where they stood, some without a sound, others spinning as if struck by invisible hammers. Still, the line moved forward. Training, habit, and hope kept them upright. We couldn't stop, one survivor said. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant fear. From the ridges behind the line, observers watched through binoculars. They saw the first waves advancing, then faltering, then vanishing into the smoke. It looked beautiful, one wrote later, and then it looked like nothing at all. By 9 o'clock, the ground between the trenches was littered with bodies. The wounded crawled back where they could. Many lay still. The guns behind them kept firing, oblivious to who was in the open. The barrage had lifted as planned. The plan had simply been wrong. In London, the church bells rang. The morning papers printed words like advance and breakthrough. But on the Somme, the only thing advancing was fire. At noon, the survivors still standing were ordered to dig in. They had moved forward a few hundred yards at the cost of tens of thousands of men. It was not a battle, one private said. It was the breaking of faith. When night came, rain began to fall again. The cries of the wounded carried through the dark. Stretcher-bearers crawled out under fire, dragging men back through the wire. We went where we heard them, one said. When the voices stopped, we moved to the next. Back in the trenches, the men sat in silence, too tired to speak. They stared into the dark, their faces lit by the faint glow of flares. We thought we were going to be heroes, a corporal wrote. Instead, we were witnesses. The first day of the Somme had not ended in victory or defeat. It had ended in realization. The old world had walked into the new and never walked back. Across the valley, hidden in the chalk and smoke, the German army waited. For weeks they had endured the British bombardment. 7 days of thunder that tore up the surface but barely touched the depths. Beneath 40 feet of earth and timber, the German soldiers lived in bunkers they had built with their own hands. Rooms carved from the chalk, lined with planks and lit by candles. We are buried alive, one officer wrote in his diary. The earth moves, but we endure. When the shelling finally stopped on the morning of July 1st, silence fell like fog. The air trembled, heavy with dust. The men below ground stared upward, listening. Then they heard it, the faint sound of whistles followed by the creak of ladders and the muffled tread of feet. The British were coming. The Germans put out their candles, shouldered their weapons, and climbed toward the light. The fog was thick, the horizon gray, and the British line seemed endless. Across no man's land, thousands of men walked shoulder to shoulder, rifles slung, bayonets fixed, as if on parade. For a moment, the German machine gunners could not believe what they were seeing. They came in ranks, one recalled, as if they did not understand what waited for them. Then came the command. Within seconds, the hills erupted in fire. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, and the air turned to metal. Bullets cut through the mist in horizontal sheets. The British lines wavered, broke, and fell. Men dropped in rows, some instantly, others spinning in silence before vanishing into the smoke. Still, the next ranks advanced and then the next. It was like mowing grass, a German gunner said. They kept standing up and we kept cutting them down. Near Serra, the 31st Division was destroyed before reaching the first belt of wire. South of there, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment climbed from its trenches too early and moved straight into open ground. Within 15 minutes, 600 of its 800 men were dead or wounded. At Thiepval, the Tyneside Irish pressed forward through a storm of machine gun fire until there was no one left to move. The line was perfect, a German wrote. Perfect and doomed. Behind them, the British artillery lifted its fire toward the second German line. Just as planned. The problem was that the first line was still very much alive. Dugouts that should have been rubble were full of defenders. The barbed wire that was supposed to be shredded stood unbroken, glinting in the mist. We fired for 7 days, a British gunner said later. We might as well have fired at the moon. In some sectors, small groups of British soldiers reached the German trenches. They fought hand-to-hand in the smoke, stabbing with bayonets, throwing grenades, clubbing with rifle butts. For a moment it seemed they might hold, but the counterfire came swift and merciless. Within minutes the gains were gone, swallowed by machine guns and mortars. From the observation posts behind the line, British officers could see little. The fog hid the carnage. Reports came in fragments, contradictions. Some divisions claimed success, others vanished entirely. Headquarters miles away believed the attack was working. The map still showed forward movement. On paper, the Somme looked like progress. By mid-morning, the ground between the trenches had become a graveyard. Men crawled through shell holes, dragging themselves through mud and wire, calling for medics who would never reach them. Stretcher-bearers went out again and again, most never returning. We worked until we couldn't lift our hands, one medic said. The ground was full of voices. Then one by one they stopped. By noon the battle had become chaos. Communication lines were cut. Runners killed, signals lost. Units fought alone, blind and deaf. Commanders shouted orders to battalions that no longer existed. Still the guns kept firing, unaware that their own men were still in the open. It was madness, one survivor wrote. No one knew who was alive or dead, only that we kept sending more. On the southern flank, the story was slightly different. There the French heavy artillery had done its work. Their shells were heavier, their aim sure, and their coordination better. The British 18th Division, fighting beside them, moved behind a creeping barrage that kept the Germans pinned. They captured the village of Montauban, the only true success of the day. For a few brief hours, the Allied plan had actually worked. Everywhere else, it had failed completely. When evening came, the guns slowed, but they did not stop. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady. The smoke and dust hung low, mingling with the drizzle. The wounded still called out, but fewer now. The living stumbled back toward the trenches, faces gray, hands shaking. We were not frightened, a private said. We were beyond that. We were empty. Behind the lines, Haig received the first reports. They were vague but hopeful. Some officers reported prisoners taken, trenches captured. Others sent nothing at all. Haig chose to believe the best. The men have fought splendidly, he wrote. The enemy must be near breaking. He ordered the attacks to continue the next morning. On the front, the men knew better. They had seen what no report could capture. The wire still intact, the guns still firing, the bodies lying in rows face down in the mud. We went forward as we were told, one soldier wrote that night, and the world did not move. At dawn, the stretcher-bearers returned to the field. They worked in silence, guided by lanterns and the faint sounds of the living. Some reached men who had been calling for 2 days. Others found only stillness. The dead were everywhere, one said. They looked asleep, like men waiting for orders. The official tally would come later, 57,470 British casualties, 19,240 of them dead, the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. The numbers were impossible to grasp, but the men at the front did not need numbers. They had seen the cost with their own eyes. The Germans called it a victory of survival. The British called it endurance. History would call it the first day of the Somme, and the guns, never satisfied, began again. At exactly 7:28 a.m. on July 1, 1916, the world on the Somme exploded. 10 mines detonated beneath the German front line, tearing open the earth and throwing men, wood, and stone hundreds of feet into the air. The largest at Hawthorne Ridge rose like a volcano, its column of flame visible for miles. A few seconds later, the debris began to fall, stones, mud, fragments of men. And then 2 minutes later, the whistles blew. Across 40 kilometers of front, 120,000 British soldiers climbed from their trenches and began to walk. They moved in line, steady and deliberate, rifles slung, bayonets fixed, heavy packs pressing against their shoulders. Behind them, the guns kept thundering, shifting their fire toward the second German line, as the plan required. Officers shouted for the men to keep formation, to hold their pace. Don't run, they had been told. Walk as if on parade, and so they did. For the first few minutes, there was only the sound of boots in the mud and the dull echo of shells landing far ahead. Some men smiled, others muttered prayers. Then from somewhere in the mist came a low, rattling growl, the unmistakable sound of machine guns. One, then many. The noise rippled across the valley until it became a single continuous roar. Bullets tore through the air, hissing low, snapping like whips. It was as if the wind had turned to steel, one survivor wrote. The first wave vanished. The second followed, and then the third. They dropped in lines, said an observer. One moment they were walking, the next they were gone. Officers tried to hold their men together, waving canes and shouting orders no one could hear. The smoke thickened. Bodies fell in heaps along the wire. A few soldiers made it to the German trenches and threw grenades into the dugouts below, but most never reached the wire at all. At Serra, the 31st Division was wiped out before crossing its own front line. At Beaumont-Hamel, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment climbed from their trenches in perfect order and advanced into open ground. They were silhouetted against the skyline, walking through fog so thin that every step was visible to the German guns. Within 20 minutes, entire companies had disappeared. Out of 801 men, only 68 answered roll call that night. Farther south, the 18th Division advanced behind a creeping barrage, one of the few sectors where the timing was right. There, the British broke through the first line and captured Montauban. Their success came not from luck, but from precision. The gunners had learned, the infantry had adjusted, and coordination had worked. On the far right, the French 6th Army moved forward with the efficiency born of Verdun, capturing trenches and villages with far fewer losses. For them, the Somme was not a disaster, but a grim triumph. Everywhere else, the day collapsed into carnage. The artillery meant to protect the infantry had betrayed them. Too many shells were duds. Too many were too light to cut the wire or reach the deep dugouts. When the barrage lifted to strike the next line, it left the first untouched. The German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers, set up their weapons, and opened fire. They were waiting for us, one British officer said. They had always been waiting. By 8 o'clock, the battlefield was a storm of smoke and screams. The ground trembled under the weight of explosions. Runners carrying messages vanished between the lines. Field telephones went silent. From the observation balloons above, the scene looked unreal, lines of men dissolving into gray fog, the flashes of shells like lightning beneath a cloud. We couldn't tell what was happening. An observer said, only that nothing was moving forward. At Thiepval, whole platoons were cut down before leaving their trenches. The Tyneside Irish fell in rows as they crossed the open field. At La Boisselle, the 34th Division advanced into a curtain of fire so dense that even the officers stopped shouting. In some places, men crawled instead of walked, dragging their rifles through the mud, trying to find shelter in shell holes that filled as fast as they dug. The wounded cried out for water. The dying asked to be turned toward home. Behind the front, commanders waited for news. Reports came in, confused, contradictory, some claiming progress, others disaster. Many units had ceased to exist, their officers dead, their signals gone. Still, Haig believed the line was moving. Success is certain, he wrote. The enemy's morale must be shattered. He ordered fresh troops to continue the attack, but the only thing moving forward now was the fire. By midday, the cries of the wounded carried across the field. Stretcher-bearers crawled through the mud, pulling men back one at a time. They moved until they collapsed. Then others took their place. We stopped listening to the guns, one medic said. We listened for voices. Some men lay out for hours, whispering names until their voices failed. The living counted the dead and ran out of numbers. When night came, rain fell again. The ground turned slick, the bodies heavy. Flares rose above the lines, lighting the fields like a stage set for ghosts. The wounded moaned softly, their voices fading under the steady drizzle. A few soldiers crawled back into their trenches, eyes wide and blank. They were not the same men who had climbed the ladders that morning. We were hollow, one wrote. We didn't speak. We just breathed. By the time the reports were tallied, the truth was undeniable. In a single day, Britain had lost nearly 60,000 men, more than 20,000 of them dead. It was the worst day in the history of the British Army. In London, the news did not arrive for days. Families waited for letters that never came. The newspapers printed words like courage, progress, and sacrifice. But behind those words was silence, the kind that fills a home when the knock comes at the door. Haig refused to call it failure. The French had gained ground. The British had learned. The enemy, he said, was weakening. He ordered the attack to continue. At the front, the survivors stared at the empty horizon. They had no language left for what they had seen. It was not fear, one wrote. It was the end of believing that anything could stop this. The rain of steel had fallen, and the new army of Britain had walked straight into it. When night fell on July 1st, 1916, the thunder of guns faded for the first time in a week. The flashes died one by one along the horizon, and the fields of the Somme were swallowed by darkness and rain. The silence that followed did not feel like peace. It felt like disbelief, a world that had stopped moving, stunned by its own violence. All across the battlefield, men lay where they had fallen. The wounded called out for help, their voices faint beneath the drizzle. Some begged for water, others for names, brothers, mothers, lovers, no one who could answer. We went where we heard them, a stretcher-bearer wrote. When one voice stopped, we listened for another. For hours they crawled through mud that clung to their hands and faces, guided only by cries that grew fewer with every passing minute. The scale of the disaster was beyond imagination. Along the northern front near Serra, whole battalions had disappeared. At Beaumont Hamel, the Newfoundlanders had been wiped out. In the center, the Accrington Pals, the Leeds Rifles, and the Tyneside Irish, all those hometown regiments that had once marched off together were gone. To the south, where the French artillery had supported the British, the 18th Division captured Montauban, one of the day's few successes. But the map of victory was small. The map of loss was endless. By midnight, reports began to reach headquarters. They were incomplete, inconsistent, and often hopeful. Progress good in the center, one cable read. Enemy resistance weakening. Haig read the messages under candlelight, tracing his fingers across maps that still showed perfect lines and colored arrows. He believed the first day had achieved its purpose. The men have fought splendidly, he wrote. The enemy's strength is waning. The truth would not reach him for another 24 hours. At the front there was no doubt. The trenches that morning had been full of laughter, cigarettes, and whispered prayers. By evening they were half empty and quiet. Men who had survived sat in the mud, staring at their boots, too exhausted to speak. We didn't curse. We didn't cry, one corporal remembered. We just sat there, breathing. The smell of blood and cordite hung over everything, a taste that stayed on the tongue no matter how much water they drank. By dawn, stretcher-bearers were still working. The wounded came back in waves, their faces pale and gray, their uniforms torn and stiff with mud. Field hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked under flickering lamps, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands trembling from fatigue. They no longer screamed, one nurse wrote. They just looked at us as if we could explain it. Outside, the rain kept falling. The wounded waited in long lines, their breath clouding the cold air. The casualty list grew longer with every hour. 57,470 British losses, 19,240 dead. Each number represented a name, a letter, a face somewhere far from home. But to the men still in the trenches, numbers meant nothing. They saw the truth laid out before them, in the bodies caught on the wire, in the empty dugouts, in the faces of the men who would never speak again. We have counted all we can, one officer said. There is no number for what remains. Back in Britain, the first telegrams arrived. Postmen carried envelopes with black seals down quiet streets. In Accrington, so many doors opened that the sound of knocking itself became unbearable. Entire neighborhoods went silent. There wasn't a family untouched, one survivor's mother recalled. Every street lost someone. Every street. The bells that had once rung for hope now tolled for mourning. Haig refused to halt the offensive. The French were still fighting at Verdun, and he believed the Germans were near collapse. Their will is cracking, he wrote. We must press on. For the men at the front, the words meant only one thing. They would climb the ladders again. The orders were the same, the ground the same, the fire the same. It wasn't war anymore, one soldier wrote. It was repetition. Those who survived the first day began to change in ways they didn't yet understand. Their humor grew darker, their silence longer. They learned to move through horror as if it were weather, something to be endured, not feared. We stopped thinking about victory, a private said. We thought about lasting till nightfall. By July 2nd, the fields were unrecognizable. The dead still lay where they had fallen, and the living dug new trenches around them. The rain turned everything into a single glistening swamp. When the sun broke through the clouds, the light was almost cruel, revealing what had been hidden in the dark. One survivor wrote, "I looked at the ground and saw faces looking back. Behind the lines, generals studied the maps and saw arrows inching forward. They called it progress. In the trenches, the soldiers measured progress by breaths. Every man alive was a victory. Every moment survived was a kind of triumph. We have moved beyond fear," a sergeant said. "We are just here." In the days that followed, the British attacked again and again. Each new assault was smaller, more cautious, but no less deadly. The same ridges, the same villages, the same wire, they became names written in blood. For the soldiers, the Somme was no longer a battle, but a landscape they could not escape. When night came again, the guns resumed their steady rhythm. The wounded cried out once more, and the stretcher-bearers went back into the dark. The rain began to fall again, washing over the fields, over the dead, over the living who could not sleep. Somewhere beyond the trenches, a single skylark sang. Its voice rose and fell through the mist, as it had all week, the only sound untouched by war. The first day of the Somme was over, though its echo would last a century. For those who survived, it was not memory. It was something still happening somewhere inside them. Forever.